In our previous videos, we were looking at designing the questionnaire for a survey. So let's dive a bit more into surveys as a form of descriptive analysis. So we're looking at the research designs, and can you remember what they are? So if we're gaining background information, we are establishing research priorities, we're defining terms. It's very open-ended, right? That is our exploratory research. And in previous videos, we have looked at secondary data analysis, focus groups, and interviews. And then we talked about observational research, which really can span exploratory as well as descriptive. And so the last videos we've been talking have been preparing us to do our descriptive research to describe who, what, when, where, and how. We often look at describing how people feel. And so we look at our attitude scales, and we can look at it in terms of a cross-sectional survey. So we're surveying people for the first time, and we survey them only once, or longitudinal surveys where we survey them multiple times, often to see if attitudes change or how they classify themselves changes by asking the same questions over a period of time. And so the type of statistical analysis we do will be different for cross-sectional surveys versus longitudinal surveys, and so we'll get to that as we get into our statistics. And the last one we have here, which we also need to discuss in more detail, is that causal research design where we create experiments and test markets. So we're moving in that direction, but we need to wrap up our discussion on survey design by here in this set of videos looking at different types of surveys and then how we choose our sample, who's going to participate in our survey. So let's continue on here by looking at surveys. So over 52% of Canadians will participate in a survey this year. When it comes to marketing research, surveys are the most popular type. The benefit of surveys is that we can have lots of people participate, and the analysis allows for quantitative, so we can do math to see if there is a statistically significant difference between different groups in terms of how they feel or how they classify themselves. Marketing research uses surveys, but it's important to note that if you are doing research for other purposes that are not about an organization's products or customers or how the organization operates, you might be using other types of research. And so, of course, we have videos on focus groups and observational research, interviews, secondary data analysis, and experiments. So you might be doing a different type. But right now, let's focus on surveys. Why are surveys so popular, is that we can get at how people feel. So observational research showed us what people do, but it didn't get at why people do those things. With surveys, we can ask them why they do those things. The downside, of course, to surveys is unlike focus groups and interviews, we can't probe to get further explanation. We often just get one shot at getting the information. But because the way we structure a survey, we can take the information and do quantitative analysis with it. Focus groups and interviews don't allow for that. We can't do the math, the statistics, that then says, see how these people feel or see how these people classify themselves. Well, that means that of the greater population, X percentage feel the same way or X percentage fall in the same group. So that ability to extrapolate to the greater population, that's why we love surveys. Okay. So we can use surveys in marketing research to identify potential customers, define who those customers are, what they like about a particular product. We can look at the process that customers go through before they take some kind of action. So we really get at why people do things, how people feel about things with surveys. There are different types of surveys, and so that's what we're going to be talking about in this video. And so we're going to go through each one of these from door-to-door interviews, executive interviews, small intercept, telephone, self-administered, mail, and online surveys. So you're going to choose how you're going to collect your data as part of that questionnaire design we talked about in the previous videos. So here we need to choose what type of survey we're going to use. So let's define them. All right, so let's start with door to door. All right, so with door to door, all right, so door to door interviews. So door-to-door interviews are interviews, meaning there is a person talking to you, as opposed to we typically think of surveys as a paper form. But this is a set of questions being asked by someone, and it is conducted face-to-face with people in their home. So I think the last door-to-door interview I encountered was actually Statistics Canada knocked on the door to ask some questions. And but otherwise, door-to-door interviews are not really done much anymore. Why? Because people don't like to open the door to strangers. The benefit of a door-to-door interview is that you do get immediate feedback, right? You're talking with a person. We can even show, if we're doing marketing research, we can show you a product, a prototype, a concept, and we're asking questions in an environment that people are more comfortable in, their home environment. However, the downside to door-to-door interviews is that because we then have to have people going door to door, it's very expensive and very time-consuming to collect a large sample size, where we got to pay people by the hour to go and knock on all these doors and have these conversations. And as we said, one of the reasons it's rarely done anymore is because people don't answer the door, so it has a very high refusal rate. When we look at Statistics Canada conducting theirs, they will often put out a flyer ahead of time saying that someone from Statistics Canada will come by, telling you what to look for to know who they are and that they are from Statistics Canada. And then they'll come by, and they're coming by in the evenings when more people are home. The idea here is that as an organization tied to the government, they do get a higher response rate than if it is just a research company themselves. Okay? But it is quite expensive for Statistics Canada to collect this information. There is an industrial equivalent to a door-to-door interview. And that is essentially where we're going and talking to organizations by going to those companies. And that is what this executive interview is, let's just write it, this is the industrial equivalent to a door-to-door. So here we're talking to someone from the business. Now, it can be hard to get executives to give up time. You're often going to have to call and schedule an appointment. And even then, you may be made to wait, frequent cancellations as things come up within the organization. So it can be difficult to get participants with those executive interviews. When we do research in business, when we're looking at strategies that an organization might take, why they might be green, those types of things, we're doing those as executive interviews. Why? Because they're not going to convey that information about their strategy and their operations in front of the competition. So a focus group wouldn't work. And they are not likely to complete a survey that we send them. So the way to get that information is face-to-face time, talking to those executives, but that means you're working around their schedule and their availability. And so it can be quite time-consuming to conduct executive interviews, but they are popular in business research when we are looking at strategy. All right, door-to-door interviews, executive interviews. The next one is what is called a mall intercept. And a mall intercept interview is an interview conducted by intercepting shoppers, typically, in high traffic locations. So the idea is you want to get participants for your survey, you go to where they are, and you then interview them face to face. Okay. So rather than going to their home, which is what we had in the very first example, or rather going to their place of work, which is the second example, in this case, we're going to where the people are. So a mall intercept survey would be that your research company has a kiosk in the shopping mall, and that people walking by, you can say, hey, can I have a couple minutes of your time to ask you questions? The key here is we're going to a place where people happen to frequent. So Procter & Gamble, General Mills, Starbucks, McDonald's, they often conduct surveys at the point of purchase. Now, right, you're here, you're buying our product, fill out a quick survey, provide us quick information related to it because you happen to be here where you're getting the product. Some malls have permanent survey facilities, right? You can rent out a location and ask those questions. Others have banned researchers from doing such activities so as not to disturb the customers. So there are some places where you'll find it and other places where it is strictly forbidden. The benefit of a mall interview is that it is less expensive. We don't have to hunt for recipients. We don't have to walk to every house trying to find people. We are where the people are. And the other benefit is that you can show a product or a prototype, a concept idea, and give feedback on it. So you have whatever you want them to take a look at. The downside to a mall intercept interview is it's not a representative or a probability sample. You are going to have a group that just happens to go to that location, and there's certain characteristics of individuals who are more likely to take the time to answer your questions, right? So it's not going to represent that greater population that you're interested in. It will be a small subset that has a lot of commonalities, and so there are missing characteristics from the greater population. And the other thing to consider is that people who are shopping want to get in and out. They're in a hurry, so they're not likely to spend a lot of time with you, which means if you're doing this, you're going to have a very short interview or questionnaire. All right, so far in terms of types of surveys, we can go and do it face-to-face with you at your home. We can do it face-to-face with you at your place of work. We can do it face-to-face with you at a place that you frequent, a high traffic location like a mall. Okay. The next ones are no longer face-to-face. So we have telephone interviews, and then we have the self-administered questionnaire, which is the piece of paper or the online survey that you're probably most familiar with. So let's talk about telephone interviews. And the reason that telephone interviews have been quite popular in the past is that you could use random digit dialing, so randomly select a phone number and make a call, which means that if your region, so we're looking at central Alberta, is the population we care about, we could randomly generate phone numbers for that particular geographic area and be more likely to get a representative sample, a probability sample, one where it reflected the different demographics of that particular area. Now, that was when more people answered the phone. Now that less people answer the phone, people would rather text. You don't answer phone calls from people you don't know. The challenge with telephone interviews is that it's no longer this real probability sample, because you are more likely to get older individuals. Younger people are a lot less likely to respond to these surveys. Now, because you can use random digit dialing to generate a number, it can be quite cheap to do telephone interviews. That's because you can automate the process where you don't actually have to have a person doing the interview until the phone call is made and somebody has picked up. And so because of that legwork, like walking to each person's home and knocking on the door, you're not having to pay for that time. So it's historically been much cheaper and provided, up until cell phones, smartphones, and the fact that people don't answer the phone anymore, it was a way to get a high quality sample quite cheap. Okay. Now, The challenge, of course, as we go through caller ID and smartphones is that, nobody picks up the phone anymore. And so telephone interviews are no longer as popular as they used to be, which is what has moved us quite a lot to the self-administered and these online questionnaires. Okay. The other challenge we have with any of these interviews, whether it is the door-to-door, the executive interview, the mall intercept, or the telephone interview, is that there can be interviewer bias. Interviewer bias is where the mannerisms of the researcher who is asking the questions influences the responses that people give. So how I word things, if I'm asking you the questions, my behavior, my non-verbal cues might turn you off from the research. You might say, well, she's just, expletive, she doesn't seem very nice. She seems kind of rude. She seems kind of cold. She's just going through the motions, doesn't really care. And that can then change the way someone responds. Or if you feel like, oh, well, that person is really great and I just want to please them and make them happy, so I will just give the researcher the answers they're looking for. Then the response isn't reflecting truly what the respondent feels or is like, but they're trying to either please the interviewer or they're upset with the interviewer, so they can be highly influenced by their perception of the researcher and the nonverbal cues that are being given off. So we have to be cognizant of that. One of the benefits of the self-administered questionnaire is that you don't have that interviewer or personality bias because we remove the interviewer from the process. All right, talking about telephone interviews, because of random digit dialing and systematic sampling, where we can make sure that we represent that people are truly selected at random, then you can get a high quality sample. Systematic sampling, what that means is that we can take the entire population and we could choose, for example, every 10th person to contact. So back when there were phone books, so maybe you've seen a phone book. So a phone book, right, was a list of everybody who lived in the area. You could do a telephone interview using a phone book by pulling every 10th person from the phone book. That is systematic sampling. We have the entire population and we know their phone numbers, and we are picking people at a particular skip interval. So we skip 9, we take the 10th. We skip 9 more, we take the next one. That is systematic sampling. It is a form of probability sampling because what it means is if we have an exhaustive list of everybody in the population we care about and we are picking, say, every 10th person, then we know the probability of any particular person being chosen. And so then we can measure the error, how far off the information we gain from the sample is from the population, so that when we try to extrapolate to the greater population, we can comment about the representation of the sample comparative to what it looks like with the bigger population. So we like probability samples because we can say, here's what we found from the sample, here's what it means about the greater group, and here's how accurate we are about that greater group because we know the likelihood that any particular person from that bigger group was selected to be in the sample. Random digit dialing, systematic sampling are methods that are probability samples. In terms of choosing a sample, a probability sample is better than a non-probability sample because we're able to extrapolate about the greater group. Okay, so they're the ideal, which is why telephone interviews have previously been the preferred method because you could create this probability sample. Okay. Now, we moved to, with telephone interviews, we said it is cheaper because we can hire a company who has an automated system that will pull a number, randomly dial it, doesn't engage the interviewer until a person picks up, right? That saves money. Attached to that is the computer-assisted telephone interviews. So the central location telephone interviews is where we have computer assisted telephone interviews. So if you've done a telephone interview, sometimes there'll be telephone interviews from provincial politicians or on behalf of political parties, they'll conduct interviews. The idea here is that with computer-assisted telephone interviews, the computer can adjust the questions based on your response. So that would be like the skip and the screen. And so the person who is actually reading you the questions is being fed the proper question based on your answer to the previous question. So what happens is that the computer says, here's what question to ask. The person on the phone asks it to you. They type in your response, and based on your response, the computer adjusts the questions. So skips screens to get to the next related question. And then the interviewer is entering your responses. So they're guided by a computer system. The other benefit of the central location telephone interviews and computer-assisted telephone interviews is that allows your organization to outsource the interviewing to a third party, a company that basically has hired people to do these phone calls. And you don't have to then be a content expert on that particular topic because the computer is telling them which questions to ask based on the answers that you give. It also allows for the monitoring of the interviews. Perhaps you've heard where, this call is being recorded for quality purposes. And so that's to ensure that we are reducing the interviewer bias to make sure that the wording, the phrasing, the conversations that are happening between those who are asking the questions and those who are answering isn't swaying the respondent. So we can monitor for quality. Okay. All right. So then let's go to a self-administered questionnaire. So typically when you think of surveys, you probably think of self-administered questionnaires. A self-administered questionnaire is where a survey, is filled out by a respondent with no interviewer present. So what can this be? Well, this could be an online survey where you are sent a link through an email, or you have a QR code that takes you to the survey. So maybe you've made a survey in SurveyMonkey or Google Forms. It can also be that there's a kiosk. Maybe there's a tablet on a stand where people can fill out the survey. We see, customer satisfaction surveys at hotels or restaurants. You might put something on a receipt when someone purchases something that they can, go to this website, provide some feedback, enter a chance to win. The thing with the survey, because it is self-administered, the benefit is that no interviewer bias. But the downside is that you are leaving it up to the respondent to, on their own, interpret the instructions and the questions. There's no probing, there's no clarification provided. So it does provide a lot more standardized approach in terms of everyone has kind of that same experience. They get the same guidance when they answer the questions. So because of that, you're not pushed in one direction or the other. That's that interviewer or personality bias. But it also means that if you don't have a well-written questionnaire, and that's what we talk about ordering the questions and careful with the wording in our previous videos, is that if there are any limitations with the way that it's worded, how it's ordered, that's confusing or unclear, that's going to highly impact how well you can use the data you've collected to inform decisions for your organization. If you are a student at Red Deer Polytechnic, you might fill out SFIs, student feedback forms, about your instructors. This would be a self-administered questionnaire, and in that case, you're filling it out online. And so again, how clear the questions are will impact, right, how you respond. There are also mail surveys, so we could send you something in the mail. And when it comes to mail surveys, there are ad hoc or one shot, so it arrives in the mail. Mail panels, this is where, as I talked about before, right, we were an AC Nielsen family growing up, which means that we'd already been kind of pre-contacted, pre-screened. They determined that our family was kind of a typical family. Basically, me and my brother, so 2 kids of each gender, a family. So if we were more kind of the typical family, then they would select us then and send us things to provide feedback. And so we tested out things like cereal and stuff like that. We gave feedback on what TV shows we watched. And so that is a mail panel. We are pre-contacted, pre-screened to be in this group of participants. And then we get periodically sent questionnaires. It is a mail panel, not a longitudinal study, because each time we got contacted to provide feedback on something, it was something completely different. Whereas the longitudinal study would follow people over time. So let's just define these. Okay. So ad hoc questionnaire. Our questionnaire is sent to selected names and addresses. Without prior contact. So the challenge with an ad hoc is that it has a very low response rate if there's been no prior contact. Let's try that again. And in fact, that response rate can be as low as 5%. An example of a ad hoc is the Alberta Consumer Product Survey. And there's some kind of enticement. I think they sent me one once and there was like a toonie attached to it. The idea here is, look, we gave you something, so please fill this out. But there's no prior contact, any pre-screening with the participants. So it can have a very low response rate. Whereas mail panels are pre-contacted and pre-screened. So we developed this list of a pool of potential participants. And you'll notice with the participants that with a mail panel, because they basically say, hey, do you want to fill out some questionnaires in the future? And they've developed a relationship with you, that then you are more likely to respond. And so you can see mail panels have as high as a 70% response rate because of that. And that was that kind of AC Nielsen example. Another example of a mail panel, there was a survey that was sent out, I don't know, about a decade ago, I guess, to me here. And it was about radio stations. And in that one, what they did is they phoned ahead and said, hey, can we send you a survey? And then if you agreed, then they would send you the paper survey in the mail. So not quite the same as being like an AC Nielsen family where you're getting lots of different surveys over time. This was just a one-time survey. But by phoning ahead, then they save money on postage and only send it out to people who are more likely to respond. So ad hoc, there's no prior contact. And mail panels, there is some pre-contact and pre-screening to increase that response rate. And then a longitudinal study is a study in which the same respondents are resampled over time. On the same issue. So when we're doing more medical research, then we have more longitudinal studies. So we might follow you as you do your health or medical treatment, and to see as you've been taking a drug or on some kind of nutrition plan, how has that changed your thoughts, your behavior, your opinions over time. And so we'd send you kind of maybe a survey to assess your mental health, your feelings of depression now, and then once you have been on the drug for a couple months, and then once you've been on the drug for 6 months, and then once you've been on the drug for a year, to see if there's any differences over time. So that's a survey. Longitudinal studies can also be in terms of our experimental designs, where you come in and we actually, you meet with a doctor, for example, and we assess and measure things about you based on that treatment. So remember, the benefit of surveys is to get about how people feel, why they do things, whereas more observational work and more experiments are more on what happens, right? All right, so we've talked about surveys. In our next video, we'll look at how do you increase the response rate to your survey, but some of that we've already chatted about, which is if you contact people ahead of time and say, hey, we're going to send this out if you're interested, or we pre-screen people to figure out if they're part of that group that we're interested in. So we develop a relationship with them, then they're more likely to participate. We also know that people are more likely to participate if we make our surveys short, if it is available in a method that is convenient to them. So looking at, as we choose different methods, what is the best way? If you're trying to increase the response rate for younger people, then a telephone survey is not going to be the way to go. We find in terms of online surveys, providing QR codes or links can increase the response rate as opposed to, say, mail. People tend to avoid both mail and telephones at this point. So people want things electronic so they can do it at their own time. When I send out surveys or advise people on designing surveys, I always tell them that they should, if it's going to be to working people, we send the online survey out at about 9:30 on a Tuesday. If you send out surveys on Fridays, it gets lost in all the mail, right? Because people are trying to wrap up their week and end their work and start their weekend. So it'll be like, this is not a priority, ignore, and then it gets permanently forgotten. If you send an online survey to people on Monday, it's in this huge pile of things that have come in on Monday. Here's all the things that need to be done, and it gets lost in all of that. So sending it Tuesday morning, not before work starts, but just after work starts, then that's going to be your higher response rate. So we tend to send things Tuesdays about 9:30, 10 o'clock if we're surveying, for example, our employees or our union members. So in our next video, we'll look at increasing the response rate.